Hi everyone, welcome to welcome to this lecture for Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, a lot of the stuff we'll talk about here is a continuation from Chapter 1, so still a lot of introductory concepts. I mentioned in Chapter 1 when we learned about the dietary reference intake values, I said that in Chapter 2 we would learn another set of guidelines for how to follow a nutritious diet, right? Or how to encourage someone to improve their nutrition status. So what the recommendations are and how we know basically what we could do to move from a diseased state to a state of health. So that's one of the things we're going to cover here. We are also just going to look at this concept of healthful diet overall, as well as a few other just kind of basic kind of foundational principles for nutrition. So let's start with the definition of a healthy diet. And I did go ahead and even just insert in writing these two definitions of diet. So let's just review these really quickly. So remember, diet in its original definition refers to the foods that a person eats, or we could say the foods that a specific community or group of people typically eats. Again, in more modern times, diet has developed a secondary definition, which is a specific way of eating that involves restriction either of calories or restriction of a certain nutrient or a specific food group for the purposes of either weight loss or for some other medical purpose. So again, when I say a healthful diet here, I mean this first definition. So I mean a healthy way of eating. So I think if you wanted to, whenever you see diet, you could just think that I'm saying way of eating, basically. Here goes that dang mouse. So a healthy way of eating. These are concepts that I do like to test on, because I think that these are concepts that any given person, that every person can carry with them throughout their lifespan, throughout their lifetime, whether they decide to go forward with nutrition as a profession or not, or whether they decide to go forward with any healthcare as a profession. We all eat every day, so these are principles that you can begin applying to your life right now, if not already. And these are principles that you and all of us can apply to our everyday decisions around food today and every day in the future. So there are 5, sometimes I say 4, but there are 5 key components of a healthy diet. These components are adequacy, moderation, nutrient density, balance, and variety. This applies to old, young, overweight, underweight, healthy, and those coping with disease or illness. So what is adequacy? So adequacy means enough, right? So an adequate diet, right? If we say something is adequate, it means it's kind of meeting the bare minimum. That's what the AI was also, right? Remember when we learned the dietary reference intake values and we said there's adequate intake, or AI? That's adequate. It's just enough, right? Probably more is better, but adequate means enough. So adequate means we're getting enough in the form of calories, we're getting enough of the various nutrients, all the vitamins, all the minerals, we're getting enough fiber to maintain health. Undernutrition occurs when a person's diet is inadequate, either in terms of caloric intake or specific nutrient, again, over a prolonged period of time, at least like 3 weeks to a month. Moderation is simply not eating too much of any one food, right? Not too much, not too little, right? So having moderate amounts of lots of different things. I'm actually going to I want to go to variety, right? Because I feel like moderation and variety go together, because when we are moderate in the different foods that we eat, or when we eat a moderate amount of all the different foods, that allows us to eat a greater variety of different foods. And variety I think, is one of the, well, these are all key components, but variety, I feel like, is sometimes lost on us in the United States. But variety is really key to having a healthy diet. As we'll see as we get into the macronutrients and micronutrients in Unit 2 and 3, all of the different nutrients that we need, and there are dozens of nutrients that we need in order to maintain healthy bodies, they come from lots of different foods. So the more varied our diet is, the more likely we are to be getting all these different nutrients. And then balance says that our diet contains different combinations of foods that provide the proper proportions of nutrients, right? So again, balance, variety, moderation, they all kind of go together, but balance is saying that, you know, we're not afraid of the carbohydrates, or we're not eating too little of it and therefore eating too much protein and fat. Or similarly, we're afraid of the fat, so we're then eating too little of it and eating too much carbohydrate and protein. So balance means we're getting enough of all of the different things that we need. And then nutrient density. So when I said on that earlier slide that I sometimes say there are 4 key components of a healthy diet, nutrient density is the 5th component that was recently added. You might also recall in chapter 1, we roughly learned the concept of energy density, where there's a lot of calories in a given gram of a food or in a given amount of food. We said that fat is very calorie dense. So nutrient density is a parallel concept, right? It's referring to a density in a food, but in this case, it's referring to the nutrient density. So nutrient density says that a food contains a lot of nutrients for the lowest number of calories. So a lot of nutrients per calorie. So something that is nutrient dense provides a lot of nutrients per calorie. Your book does a lot of these day of meals images to kind of compare one concept to another. So this is comparing on the left meals that are low in nutrient density to meals that are high in nutrient density. This is probably a really good image to begin to familiarize yourself with, because if you look down this list of foods, right, we see things like soda or like a grape drink, white toast, cereal, hamburger and chips. What do we have here? White rice, candy. Hopefully, it's not a stretch for you to identify that these are not nutrient-dense foods. These are all actually calorically dense foods. These are energy-dense foods, but they are not nutrient-dense foods. Like, would you ever recommend to a person to go drink a soda and eat chips and a hot dog and have a healthy meal? Like, hopefully that isn't a stretch. Maybe it is. And if it is, that's great. We'll work on that throughout the semester. But if you come over to the right-hand side and take a look at some of these examples of food. So this is oatmeal, whole wheat toast, grapefruit juice, whole grain bread, turkey breast, yogurt, carrots, lettuce, tomato, spinach, bell pepper, kidney beans, brown rice, broccoli, mixed berries. Hopefully, even just as you hear those foods or see their images, you're thinking, yeah, sure. So if I was recommending a healthy meal or a healthy snack, I might include some of those things like broccoli or oatmeal or grapefruit juice, right? These foods are rich in nutrients. And as we're learning in this concept of nutrient density, they're rich in nutrients and low in calories, effectively. So when we're shifting towards a healthier pattern of eating, we would necessarily be shifting away from low nutrient dense foods towards, meaning we start to choose more often and more frequently, high nutrient density foods. So we did balance and variety. Okay, so we can use those 5 key components of a healthy diet, like I said, all day, every day, to influence our food choices, right? Anytime you go about planning a meal or going grocery shopping or choosing what to get off of a menu, you can think about, okay, am I choosing foods that are nutrient dense, or am I choosing foods that are calorie dense? Is there a variety of food here? Am I getting a balance of different food groups, different nutrients? Am I getting enough, right? And am I getting a moderate amount? So you can use those all day, every day. Here, that what we're going to go forward with now are other resources that you can also utilize to guide your choices in healthy eating. And again, if you do pursue a health profession, you can utilize these same resources and tools to encourage your clients or patients to also figure out ways to shift towards healthier food choices. So these tools include reading food labels, reading ingredients lists, understanding the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and this is this other set of recommendations that I referenced in Chapter 1. This goes hand in hand with the food plate and the food patterns in my plate. Those last two are kind of the same thing. Okay, so food labels, let's go through these. Food label, we're talking like the whole label, the whole package. So front of the label, back of the label, side panel. So food labels, much of what is on a food label is actually regulated by the FDA. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration of the federal government. So of the labeling that is regulated by the FDA, there are 5 components that most packaged foods have to have on their label. And those 5 components are a statement of identity, what's in the package, the ingredients list, the name and address of the the company that made the food, and then the nutrition facts panel, which provides nutrition information. Let's go through each of these individually. Or maybe we don't go through each of these, but we'll talk about them more here. So let's start with, let's just see if we can follow from the previous slide. So the name, right? The name of the product has to be written. Usually that's on the front of the label or the top of the label, depending on what it is. The useful information. Yeah, okay. That's funny that it says useful. I think I would have reviewed these, I guess, before I recorded. So the name has to be on there. The manufacturer information is usually on a side panel, and it's actually usually underneath the nutrition facts panel. But it has to give you the name and the address of the manufacturer, or sometimes it'll be the distributor or the packager. The net weight of the package has to be on there, so that's what is meant here by net contents of the package, net weight. And then the nutrition facts panel, this one we will go through in much more detail, and then the ingredients list. So nutrition facts panel and ingredients list are usually next to each other or above or below. Ingredients list, we may circle back to this, but I do want to just say here, an ingredients list is written in descending order by weight, which means the first ingredient that's listed is the most abundant ingredient by weight. So this Heritage Flakes cereal is the number 1 ingredient is Coruscant wheat flakes, or wheat flour, excuse me, Coruscant wheat flour. The second most abundant ingredient is wheat bran. The third most abundant is whole wheat meal. The fourth most abundant is cane sugar, and on and on down the list. So the least most abundant is honey. What you'll notice is that there are a bunch of other things on this package, right? There's this thing that says new look. There's a thing that says always organic. There's this thing that says 6 ancient grains and 5 grams of protein per serving. So some of these are claims, and we will come back to these actually towards the end of the course, but some of these are claims, many of which are actually regulated, again, by the FDA, but some of which aren't. Some of them are just marketing, right? So new look, same great taste, that's just a marketing. Always organic, that's just marketing. 5 grams of protein per serving, this one is regulated by the FDA. Again, we'll talk more about that later on. 6 ancient grains, that's not a regulated claim, that's just marketing and advertising. And then even same with some of these identifiers down here, so USDA organic and non-GMO. These are not, well, they can be used as a marketing feature, but these also do have certification behind them. So again, those are aspects of labeling that we won't actually talk about right here, right now, but we will circle back to these at the end of the semester. Okay, so those are the 5 components of the food label. Now let's talk specifically about the nutrition facts panel. So the nutrition facts panel can definitely be a great tool to help guide us in making healthy food selections. So the nutrition facts panel is where most of the nutrition information about the food is housed. And you can use the nutrition facts panel, again, in multiple ways. One of the things you could do is to compare, one of the ways you could use it is, say you're looking at cereal or salad dressings. You could use the nutrition facts panel and the ingredients list to compare 2 foods, 2 different options of the same food, and select the one that is healthier. So the nutrition facts panel also has, I would say 5 components, but I think I wrote it out here as 4. So we'll say that it has 4 key components we're going to take a look at. There's serving size and servings per container, and that we'll look at the actual example in just a minute. There's caloric information. There's something called the percent daily values. And percent daily values are really helpful with a few specific nutrients. A percent daily value actually is a reference to the RDA. And it's saying, based on the recommended dietary allowance for this nutrient, 1 serving of this food provides this percentage of that total daily allotment. So it's how much a single serving of this food contributes to the overall recommended intake for that nutrient that day. I think these are 2 helpful guidelines. So typically, if you see that the percent daily value is 5 or less, it means that that specific nutrient is low. If the percent daily value is 20% or more, it typically means that the nutrient content in that serving is relatively high. Some nutrients where you might want to pay attention to the percent daily value would be sodium, right? Because remember, sodium is one of those nutrients that has a tolerable upper intake level. And for anyone who has high blood pressure, just baseline high blood pressure, they might want to be looking to have pretty low sodium intake. So it would actually be helpful to find a food that has less than 5% daily value of sodium per serving. Similarly, we haven't talked much about fiber yet, but fiber is a really important nutrient. So really important for health. So if we find one that has 20% or more, or close to 20% of the daily value, you might say, cool, that's a healthy food because it's really high in fiber. Similarly, going back to sodium, if you find one that has 20% of the daily value of sodium per serving, that's really high in sodium. Maybe put that back on the shelf and select another one. Lastly, down here, labels now include percent daily values and precise amounts per serving for added sugar, vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, and then they might also for A and C. So the food labels were actually updated in recent years. So this last bullet here is just noting some of the recent changes to the nutrition facts panel. And then there's always a footnote on the nutrition facts panel. It actually defines percent daily value for you in case you forget what it is. It notes that percent daily value is always based on a 2,000 calorie diet. So again, if your caloric needs per day are fewer than 2,000 calories, the percent daily value will be a little askew. Or if most of us, again, don't eat specifically a 2,000 calorie diet, so the percent daily value is always going to be a rough estimate for us. And not all foods Not all food packages do have this little footnote. Okay, so here is the image. Again, a lot of the foods that we buy are like a box or some kind of bag. So the nutrition facts panel is either on a side panel or on the back of, or the bottom, right? Or the, you might have to look around for it. It's not always so obvious, especially on smaller packages, but it's there, it has to be there. So this says old label and new label. So again, I think it was 2016 actually, it was probably before 2016, but these updates were supposed to go live in 2018 and they started to go live. There's still, many food manufacturers are still phasing out the old label. So even though we're a few years out, several years out from 2016 and a few years out from 2018, we still see some of the old labels sometimes. So I'm not going to point everything out on the old label because ultimately we'll only be seeing the new label. But let's just review these 5 pieces. So there's the serving size and the amount per serving. So that, I guess if you compare old to new, that was increased. The font, well, it was made bold. So the size didn't increase, but they made it bold to say, okay, look, the 1 serving is only 2/3 cup. It's not the entire box of cereal. They also did increase the font size on calories per serving and put that in bold too. And then another new piece was the added sugar line. That's new on the food label. We'll talk more about added sugars in chapter 4 when we talk about carbohydrates. What else to say here? So down the line here is percent daily value. And you can see here with the sugar, so this is 20%, right? So that's high. That means that's a lot of added sugar in 1 serving of that food. And here's 5% on the saturated fat. That's a relatively low number, right? Or that's 5 or lower. That's not a ton of saturated fat per serving. So good. Yeah. So how would you use a nutrition facts label? Any of these things we've been looking at, actually. So paying attention to the different macronutrients, the fat, the carbohydrates, the protein, and looking to see, okay, this is giving me a decent amount of carbohydrate, a decent amount of fiber, maybe too much added sugar though. This is giving me a relatively low amount of saturated fat, that's good. And protein, interestingly, you'll see does not have a percent daily value, and that is only because protein requirement varies a lot actually throughout the lifespan, and depending on a life stage like pregnancy or lactation. But you can start to get kind of a scientific image of the food you're eating and assess. Again, as we go throughout the semester, you'll be able to reflect back on this information and utilize the knowledge you'll be gaining to really read these labels and inform your decision making. Like the sodium again, geez Louise. The sodium is 7% daily value. That's not low, but it's relatively low, right? And then also calories, like as you start to understand how many calories you need per day, you'll be able to assess, okay, 1 serving of this is probably an appropriate amount of calories based on my total daily needs. So largely, the nutrition label can help you assess calories, macronutrient intake, and a few specific micronutrients like vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Okay, I was wrong. I thought actually this information was at the end of the semester, but good, it's right here. So the claims that we might find on a food package. So let me just toggle back here, right? Like the 5 grams of protein per serving or the ancient grains. One of these, the top one, is actually an approved health claim. The other one is just marketing. So come back here. So the FDA does regulate some of these health claims, and they divide them into 3 categories: nutrient content claims, qualified health claims, and authorized health claims. And then other things that might appear on a food label are made without FDA approval, proof, or guarantee that the stated benefits are true. Something like this improves memory, right? Kind of a structure function claim. It might be true, but there's no actual regulation behind a statement like that. Whereas an example of an FDA approved claim would be low in sodium. This is actually an FDA approved claim that indicates that that particular food is in fact low in sodium being defined as 140 milligrams per serving or less. So here, let's see, I think this is 2 pages. Yeah. So this chart, which spans 2 pages, is a chart of the FDA-approved nutrient-related terms and definitions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I don't actually test you on these because it's a lot to try to memorize. But this would be a great thing, especially if you were going to continue in any sort of health profession, to like print something like this out and have it available for your reference, or save it somewhere on your personal laptop or something so that you can reference it as needed. But any of these claims are actually regulated by the FDA and have a meaning behind them. So if you see any of these claims, the claims are listed here in the middle column. Fat-free, low-fat, reduced fat, saturated fat-free, low-calorie, low sugar, sugar-free, more or added fiber. These are technically approved nutrient claims. So on the, on the third column, you can see what the actual definition is behind that claim. I want to point out a few here. So fat-free, let's just start there. Something can be with FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration approval, a food can say, this is a fat-free food. Meanwhile, it can have ½ gram of fat per serving. So fat-free, the FDA-approved definition of fat-free is that a food has ½ gram of fat per serving or less. Just FYI. Something that is low fat by FDA definition has 3 grams of fat or less per serving. Same thing goes with like saturated fat-free. It has to have less than ½ gram of saturated fat and less than ½ gram of trans fat per serving. Same would go like with cholesterol. So low saturated fat means 1 gram of less per serving. Reduced saturated fat, at least 25% less saturated fat. So cholesterol-free is this line down here. If you see the term cholesterol-free, it means there are fewer than 2 milligrams of cholesterol per serving and fewer than 2 grams of saturated fat per serving. So take some time here. Also the same is true with sugar-free. Like if it's sugar-free, it actually could still have ½ gram of sugar per serving. Yeah, those I think are the ones I want to point out to you. Same thing with sodium-free up here. So just note, right, these are FDA-approved claims. There is an actual definition behind them. So some of them, it might be easy enough for you to memorize, the ones that you maybe see more often or are interested in personally. But otherwise, again, save this somewhere. And these are just charts from your textbook. So you take a picture from the textbook. Or again, like print these slides out. This would be a nice reference for you to have. This information, though, is also online, so you don't even need to necessarily save it. You could always reference it at fda.gov. It has to be public access. And then these are the approved health claims. So health claims, let's see, these are nutrient-related terms, right? So I don't think her box had, so this is a nutrient claim, 5 grams of protein per serving. That's just a claim about the amount of protein in the food. So a health claim is making some statement about the person's health based on the contents of this food. So again, the middle section is telling you kind of the nutrient related to the claim. But the claims, the examples of the claims you might see on the box or on the label are over here on the right. So a claim you might see is like low-fat diets rich in fiber-containing grain products, fruits and vegetables may reduce the risk of some types of cancer. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one more time. I don't think we had a claim. Yeah. Sometimes what you'll see is there will be like, you know, with Cheerios, I think is a classic example. It'll say like reduces the risk for heart disease, asterisk. And then at the bottom of the box, there will be an asterisk down here. And that's where the claim will be written out. So you can start to look around for nutrient claims. Or sorry, that would be a health claim. So you'll see health claims related to calcium and bone health. You'll see nutrient claims related to saturated fat, cholesterol, fiber, whole grains, folate, sugar alcohols, sodium, potassium. Again, these can all be found on FDA.gov. All right, so those are the ones that are approved by the FDA. Again, there's lots of other stuff you might see on a food label or on a food package. You can start to just pay attention and decipher, okay, this is an actual health claim. This one doesn't seem to be a health claim. It's probably just more marketing. It's just the company trying to get you to buy the food. Alrighty, so now we can move into talking about the dietary guidelines for Americans, and then in this section we'll be talking about the healthy eating plate and the food patterns. So again, remember back in chapter 1, I said there are basically two national, in the United States, two national guidelines or sets of recommendations for how we can eat healthy diets or how we can eat healthfully. The one we talked about in chapter 1 is the dietary reference intake values. We learned about 6 different DRIs. I said that there are 4 really important ones to pay attention to: the RDA, the tolerable upper limit, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, and the estimated energy requirement. So now this is the dietary guidelines for Americans. Totally different. The purpose and the application is the same though. So remember, the dietary reference intake values are written by the National Academies of Sciences. They are an independent group of experts and researchers in engineering, medicine, health, etc. The dietary guidelines for Americans are written by our federal government. So they're written jointly by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I do like to ask this question. I like to make it known that the dietary guidelines for Americans are written by the federal government. The dietary reference intake values are written by scientific experts. There's a big difference. So I typically ask you who wrote what on the test. Again, their application is meant to be the same. So the dietary guidelines are designed to promote health, right? That sounds very similar to the dietary reference intake values. They're meant to reduce risk of disease and chronic disease, and to reduce the prevalence of overweight and obesity. A really big difference is that the dietary guidelines for Americans are updated every 5 years, whereas the dietary reference intake values are pretty established. As the science of nutrition evolves and as our scientific research evolves collectively, we are likely to acquire new information that might necessitate a revision to the dietary reference intake values. Cholesterol is actually one example. The dietary reference intake values, I don't remember exactly when this changed. Let's say 20 years ago, the dietary reference intake value, there was a dietary reference intake value for cholesterol. And it suggested that we should not consume more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day. That guideline somewhere in the last 10 years was dropped because we actually we accumulated enough scientific evidence that said cholesterol in the diet does not relate strongly enough to blood cholesterol levels that we need to have this strict upper level intake for cholesterol. So there was a revision made to the dietary reference intake levels, and the upper level for cholesterol was dropped as a reference intake value. So those do get revised, but kind of on a, just based on scientific findings. Whereas the dietary guidelines for Americans, similar to Healthy People 2020, that like public health promotion plan, the dietary guidelines have a routine update every 5 years to make sure that the guidelines do reflect the latest scientific evidence. So I don't know why I still have the 2015 guidelines in here, but 2015 to 2020 guidelines were pretty similar to what they are currently. Let's look at the current guidelines. So 2020 to 2025, these are our current dietary guidelines. They have 4 major objectives, or 4 major guidelines. So this is what our federal government advises any and all of us to do in order to follow a healthy way of eating. So follow a healthy dietary pattern throughout your lifespan. Customize and enjoy nutrient-dense foods and beverages that reflect your personal preferences, your cultural traditions, and your budget. Focus on meeting the food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages, and stay within your calorie limits. Don't consume excess calories, though they don't say that explicitly. Limit your foods and beverages that are high in added sugars, high in saturated fat, high in sodium, and limit your alcoholic beverage intake. Those are the 4 overarching guidelines. Some of the underlying principles for a healthy eating pattern, right? So follow a healthy eating pattern. When I first saw that, I didn't love it. When it came out in 2020, I thought, well, that's silly. I think it even came out in 2015, yeah. Follow a healthy eating pattern, same thing. But I guess I've come to appreciate it somewhat, because when you think about what a pattern is, it's something that repeats, right? It's something that happens maybe over and over again, right? If you see a pattern emerging, it's like, oh, that happened, and it happened again, it happened again. That I think is actually really key, because health and wellness, as we said in chapter 1, is not a moment in time. It's an active and ongoing process. So if we're going to be healthy, we need to continually be engaging in healthy behaviors like healthy eating. So if we have healthy eating patterns, it means that consistently over time, we're engaging in healthy food choices. So dietary pattern we could define as the combination of foods and beverages that constitute an individual's complete dietary intake over time. Again, that concept of over time. We also saw that with nutrient-related deficiencies developing, right? They don't develop because you didn't eat an orange today. They develop because you haven't had any fruit for the last month, right? That's how you get vitamin C deficiency. Over time, not just because of one action or lack of action. Nutrient-dense foods should be met primarily, nutrient needs should be met primarily from nutrient-dense foods, right? So kind of a repeat of what was on the previous slide. So again, nutrient-dense foods, we haven't actually said this so explicitly yet, but these are our nutrient-dense foods. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, seafood, eggs, beans, peas, and lentils, salt, unsalted nuts and seeds, fat-free and low-fat dairy products, and lean meats and poultry. So these foods provide vitamins, minerals, and other health-promoting components. They have few added sugars, they're low in saturated fat, and they're low in sodium. That's convenient because one of the other recommendations was to limit foods and beverages that have added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium. So by focusing on nutrient-dense foods, we kind of meet 2 objectives at once. Also important to recognize that healthy eating patterns are adaptable. So, and there's no one way. There is no singular healthy eating pattern. So I do also really appreciate this recommendation here, that your healthy eating pattern reflects your personal preferences, your culture, and your budget, right? There are countless ways to have a healthy eating pattern. And adaptable, right? So even throughout the lifespan, right? Whether you're pregnant or lactating, or whether you're young or old or getting older, you can adapt your food, your healthy eating patterns to suit your needs and preferences as they evolve. So here is the My Plate icon, and maybe you've seen this before. You can also go to choosemyplate.gov if you want to, and I encourage you to, because again, that would just facilitate greater understanding of what this is, not just as a recommendation, but also as a resource, an active resource for you to share with family and friends. And again, this would be a tool and a very important teaching tool if you were to pursue a health profession and career. This would be something you'd probably share pretty regularly with folks. So My Plate is the visual representation of the USDA Dietary Guidelines. On the website, it is pretty interactive, and they do have access to kind of a personalized guide, so you can, again, apply some of the concepts of individuality there. There is a Spanish language version available. There might be more than just Spanish language, but I can't say if that's true for certain. Yeah, so I think we'll go through the plate in a little more detail here. So here is the plate. Hold that image in your mind, right? It's a plate. It's split in half. One half is composed of fruits and veggies. The other half is grains and protein. And then it has a section for dairy. All right, so key components of the plate. That's cool. You'll see some of these key components of a healthy diet, right? Eat in moderation to balance your calories. Eat a variety of different foods. Consume the right proportion of each recommended food group. Personalize your eating plan. Increase your physical activity, and set goals that help you gradually improve your food choices and overall lifestyle health. So let's talk a little more about these 5 food groups: grains, veggies, fruits, dairy, and protein. I think I have each of these on a separate slide, so I might toggle back to this one. Let's see what we can get on these slides. Okay, so grains, some of the recommendations in choosing grains and eating grains. From the federal government, the recommendation is to make, I would say at least, but the recommendation is make half of your grains whole. So when you're choosing grain foods, choose whole grain foods as often as possible. Whole grain foods provide fiber. Fiber is a type of carbohydrate. Whole grains are also a good source of riboflavin, thiamine, niacin, iron, folate, zinc, protein, and magnesium. If it's not a whole grain, it's not a good source of fiber, riboflavin, thiamine, niacin, iron, folate, zinc, protein, or magnesium. The serving is the recommended amount per day is 6 ounces. And again, that can come from whole grains themselves, like your oatmeal, whether that's rolled oats or steel cut oats, brown rice, wild rice, quinoa, farro, millet, polenta. Certainly you could supply grains by eating whole grain breads, whole grain cereals, whole grain crackers, and whole grain pasta. Let's talk a tiny bit here about whole grains. So we could also be talking about this when we talk about carbohydrates, but we'll talk about it here and we'll probably revisit it in the carbohydrate lecture. So what is a whole grain actually? I sometimes like to insert the word intact. Intact. Meaning not broken up, into any sort of pieces too much, right? The integrity is maintained. So whole grains are seeds. Whole grains are seeds actually of grass plants, as it were. So whole grains are seeds. Oftentimes the seed is referred to as a kernel, and it's composed of 3 parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. There is usually a husk, which might be a 4th part, usually it's the outer part that's not really edible by humans. But it is kind of a protective layer that keeps the seed, the intact seed safe and whole inside. This beautiful picture shows us images of lots of different grains. It looks like we have a black quinoa here, maybe a red quinoa here, maybe a white quinoa here. Ooh, tricky. This looks like amaranth. This looks like buckwheat. This one looks like it might be millet. This one looks like it might, I don't know. This one looks like it might be teff. Maybe oats here, maybe a whole wheat here. I'm really blanking on that one. Have a thought in my mind, but it's not coming out. And then this is rice, right? So all of these are grains, and when you look at them here, they look like seeds, right? Like any other seed you might see, like a poppy seed or a chia seed or a flax seed or a pumpkin seed. Grains are just also seeds, and they are most nutritious for us when they look like this. So that's why I say intact, because it's the whole grain still in whole grain form. The transgression, I guess, from a whole grain is a refined grain. So what's the difference, and why are whole grains so much better? So a refined grain refers to a grain that is no longer whole, and it's no longer whole because it's either missing one or two of those three original components. So it's either missing the bran, the germ, or the endosperm. Well, actually, it's usually missing the bran and the germ. So white flour and white rice are examples of refined grains. A lot of times if it's refined, we call it white. White grains have had their bran and their germ removed, which leaves just the endosperm. So refining is the process of removing the bran or the germ. That's why we call them refined grains. I guess saying white is a little easier, and often the refining process often leaves the grain a whiter color, because the bran and the germ, that's where we have a lot of fiber, and that's where we have a lot of other nutrients that might impart some color to the seed. And when we remove that, we're really left with mostly starchy carbohydrate, which often is more neutral or whitish in color. Sometimes also the grain might be bleached at the end of the processing, so then it's a refined bleached grain, and then it's really white in color. So refining is so contrary to health, because refining removes not just the bran and the germ, but in removing the bran and the germ, we remove about a quarter of the protein from the grain, and we remove half to 2/3 or more of the various nutrients that are commonly found in the bran and the germ. So what's left in the refined grain is not a whole lot that's super healthy for us. I mean, yes, carbohydrate is healthy for us, but remember back to those terms of balance, variety, moderation. When we have a whole grain, we have a food that is naturally balanced with fat, vitamins, minerals, carbohydrate, protein. When we refine the grain, we pretty much just have carbohydrate left. There's nothing else to that food that's nutritionally beneficial for us. And too much of anything can become problematic. That's why moderation is one of the recommendations for one of the key components for a healthy diet, right? So if suddenly we took this food that was itself a complete, balanced, varied food, and we reduced it down to just one nutrient, we don't need to eat a lot of it then. And really, we shouldn't even eat it all that often, right? We just took a really healthy food and made it relatively unhealthy for us. All right, what did I skip? Okay, so that's what I'll say about whole grains. And I think it's really just an important conversation, because whole grains is one of 5 designated food groups under the USDA Dietary Guidelines. And yet in the United States, we eat a massive amount of refined grains and call them grains. Because actually, if we look at this picture, Or if we look at the 5 food groups, one of the groups is grains, not whole grains. In my professional opinion, it should say whole grains, but it says grains. And again, the recommendation is actually at least half of the grains you eat should come from whole grain sources. My recommendation is as many as you can, so as close to all of the whole grains you eat should actually be whole grains. And again, the recommendation on whole grains is about 6 ounces per day. Okay, so then vegetables. So veggies, again, include variety. This is a really key place to have variety. Go by color to help inform variety. So one of the things I like to suggest is when you go grocery shopping or when you shop for your vegetables, see if you can buy all the colors of the rainbow, fruits and vegetables. So green, red, orange, yellow, white, purple, blue, right? The recommendation is a minimum of 2.5 cups of vegetables per day. Vegetables are an excellent source of fiber, phytochemicals, phytonutrients. We'll learn about those in Unit 3. Carbohydrates, vitamin A and C, folate, potassium, and magnesium. We get a lot of different nutrients from our veggies. Fruits, again, focus on variety. Choose whole fruits when possible, and especially choose whole fruits in place of fruit juice, because fruit juice can wind up being pretty concentrated in sugar. The recommendation is to have at least 2 cups of fruit per day. And similar to vegetables, fruits are an excellent source of fiber, phytonutrients, vitamin A and C, folate, potassium, and magnesium. Potassium and magnesium are interesting. These are 2 of our major minerals that we'll talk about in Unit 3. The best sources of these nutrients are fruits and vegetables. A lot of people in the United States are like subclinically deficient in potassium and magnesium because we just don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. So 2 cups for fruit, 2.5 cups for veggies is the recommendation. Dairy, so again, these are our federal guidelines, and interestingly written by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The U.S. Department of Agriculture also oversees agriculture, like dairy and meat production. So not surprisingly, dairy makes its way onto the recommended eating plate. Many other healthcare professionals, myself included, wouldn't and don't actually recommend dairy. So there is some controversy in terms of the dairy recommendation here. Dairy can absolutely be part of a healthful diet. It's just my professional opinion that it should not be a required part of a healthy diet. So the national guidelines are that we should choose low-fat and fat-free dairy products. And if you have a dairy intolerance, as most human beings do have an intolerance to cow's milk, because we aren't cows, then if you can't consume cow's milk, you could choose a lactose-free or a low lactose, or you could choose something like a plant-based milk product, like a soy product, an oat product, a rice product, or an almond product, etc. I sort of naturally left it out here, but if we go back to this image, the national guidelines for dairy intake are to consume 3 cups a day of dairy products. Again, in my professional opinion, this is harmful, I'll say. This is actually a really harmful recommendation. We'll learn about, as we go forward, that about 2/3 of the adult population in the United States is lactose intolerant, meaning cannot digest lactose. And that's largely because as human beings, we would typically wean from our mother's breast milk around 1 or 2 years of age. And lactose, we'll talk about this when we talk about carbohydrates, but lactose is one of our basic sugar molecules. Lactase is the enzyme that digests lactose. So typically when we wean from our mother's breast milk, we stop making lactase. And this has been the case for humans throughout our evolution, especially for parts of the world where consuming the milk of other animals has not been a common practice over the last hundreds of thousands of years. So anyone who's not producing lactase after age 2 is going to have a really hard time digesting something that has lactose in it, hence lactose intolerance. So again, in my opinion, most people should actually start to wean off of cow's milk because cow's milk does have lactose in it, and well, again, technically we're not cows, so we shouldn't necessarily be drinking a cow's milk. Again, cow's milk can be part of a healthful diet, same with goat or sheep or whatever other animal's milk you want to drink, mouse milk. I'm just saying it should not be a requirement because most people actually don't tolerate it well. We will say more on that in chapter 4. Last group is the protein foods group. So again, these recommendations are coming from the Department of Agriculture. The recommendation is to choose low-fat or lean meats and poultry. A new addition is to include more fish, beans, peas, eggs, nuts, seeds, and soy products. The reason being, these are much lower in saturated fat, and when we get to the chapter on lipids and fats, we'll see that saturated fat is a nutrient we should be reducing. And in fact, if you just toggle back a few slides, that is one of the 4 components of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans currently, is to reduce saturated fat intake. Meat and poultry, even if low fat or lean, are still very high in saturated fat. Whereas fish and these different plant foods are very low in saturated fat. Most fish and these plant foods are also very low in cholesterol, and these plant foods have no cholesterol. I mean, eggs have cholesterol, that's not a plant food. Additionally, these plant sources of protein, so beans, peas, nuts, seeds, and soy, have a ton of fiber, which we also can't find. We don't have fiber in eggs, fish, or lean meats and poultry. So lots of reasons to focus your protein intake more on these foods: fish, beans, peas, eggs, nuts, seeds, and soy, and to reduce intake of meats and poultry. But again, all will provide protein. Also, some of the recommendations for protein intake are to consider how you're cooking it, to choose methods of cooking that don't involve so much added oil, perhaps. The recommended amount of protein foods is 5.5 ounces per day. Think about the last time you had a burger or a steak or a chicken sandwich or something. How many ounces of meat were in that steak or burger or whatnot? Most times, so many of us, one single serving of a protein-rich food exceeds the daily recommendation. In the United States, most people are overeating protein foods. This group provides protein as well as phosphorus, vitamins B6 and B12, magnesium, iron, zinc, niacin, riboflavin, and thiamine. So most of our protein-rich foods provide a lot more than just protein. All right, and then oils, not its own food group, or not a food group that's listed on the food plate, but just an important one to make note of. So in modern times, we do consume added oils. The healthier oils to choose would be vegetable oils, seafood oils, and then kind of nut oils like olive oil, avocado oil, walnut, or coconut. There isn't a specific recommendation for how much oil to have. My professional recommendation would be to limit it to as little as possible, maybe not exceeding like a tablespoon or 2 per day. And then there are some, again, depending on the person's health condition, there would be some reasons to actually recommend little to no added oil if possible. And that would specifically be in the case of heart disease or other issues related to cardiovascular disease. But 1 to 2 tablespoons of oil a day, especially if you're choosing healthful oils, can be part of a nutritious diet. All right, so another term to jot down in your notebook here, empty calorie. We've talked about nutrient density and energy density. This is a third related concept, which is empty calorie. So empty calories are calories that come from solid fats and or added sugars. They are calories that provide few or no additional nutrients. Like, let me just go back here. right? We said that these protein-rich foods also provide phosphorus, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, magnesium, iron, zinc, niacin, riboflavin, thiamine. These are all vitamins and minerals, right? Protein is a calorie-containing nutrient. So a protein food provides, a protein-rich food like these, listed here, provide calories and lots of other nutrients. Something that has a lot of solid fats like lard or butter or vegetable shortening, or something that has a lot of added sugar like Coca-Cola or candy, or a lot of baked goods. A lot of baked goods have solid fat and added sugar. They're not, like, that's a lot of calories, and there's not really any other nutrients to speak of. Like, you're not getting vitamin C out of that. You're not getting a lot in the way of vitamin B6 or B12 or potassium or magnesium. So empty calories are calories that typically come from solid fat or added sugar and provide no additional nutrients or few additional nutrients. So part of the USDA recommendations are to limit these foods to a small number, 0 if possible, and to keep them within your calorie budget. So keep them within your estimated energy requirement. Foods with the most empty calories include all of our processed junk foods, right? Cookies, cakes, pastries, donuts, soft drink, fruit juice, cheese, pizza, sausage, hot dog, bacon, ribs, ice cream. Yes, you might look at these and be like, okay, well, those are protein foods, but they are not low fat or lean meats or poultry, fish, beans, eggs, nuts, peanuts, seeds, and soy products, right? These are very processed forms of meat that, yes, provide some protein and a lot of fat and sometimes added sugar. So they should be reduced, if not eliminated, where possible. Okay, so circling back, here is the recommendation to limit foods and beverages that have added sugar, saturated fat. That's what SAT fat is saturated fat, sodium, and alcohol. These are part of the dietary guidelines for Americans currently. So again, the federal guidance on nutrition says limit added sugars for females no more than 6 teaspoons per day, for males no more than 9 teaspoons per day. 1 teaspoon is about 4 grams. So that's how I get those numbers. Another way of saying that is that less than 10% of calories per day, starting at age 2, that's a lot. That's still a lot. And to avoid food and beverage with added sugar for those under 2. The recommendation on saturated fat is less than 10% of total daily calories, starting at 2. Again, in our diet, we primarily get saturated fat from fatty and processed meats and other processed foods that have added oils in them. So these processed meats, so sausage, hot dog, bacon, ribs, also cheese and pizza, these are the primary sources of saturated fat in our diet. So again, so empty calories, typically you're going to find empty calories, you're usually going to find saturated fat and added sugar together. Sodium, we've already touched on this a couple of times, but here the recommendation is, again, less than 2,300 mg per day. That's the tolerable upper intake level. Again, if anyone who has an existing heart condition probably would be at 1,500 mg or less. And then alcoholic beverages, so limit those to 2 drinks or less per day for males and 1 drink or less per day for females. That's considered moderate. What else? So number and size of servings. So the number of servings recommended is based on age, sex, and activity level. And I'm sorry, there are a few places where these slides were pre-written by the textbook company. And then I've gone through and edited them, but there are places where I haven't edited thoroughly enough. So forgive me where it still says gender where it should say sex. I know that's happened a few times in this lecture. So the amount of servings are based on age, sex, and activity level, right? So somebody who is 18 and plays for the high school football team and runs track and field and plays baseball in the spring, that person is going to need a lot more calories than, say, their mother, who's maybe, 45, works a desk job and doesn't do any exercise, right? So activity level, age, and sex all influence the amount of food that we need to consume in a day to maintain our health. So this concept of ounce equivalent is what was developed by the federal government to help kind of define serving size a little more. So if we go all the way back, I guess I'll do it. If we go all the way back here, you'll see that grains, the recommendation is 6 ounces of whole grains per day. Fruit and veggie, the recommendation is in cups per day. Same with dairy, but then protein is 5.5 ounces per day. So it's the protein group and the grain group where the recommendation is written in ounces. And those are really the two that vary quite a bit based on activity level and age. Both are going to go up with activity level. So the more active a person, the more protein and the more grain they would need. And typically the younger they are, like during those physical development years, they also need more protein and more whole grain. It says it right here, for the grains and the meats and beans groups. No nationally standardized definition of a serving size currently exists for any food. That's really important. So that's why on many food packages and food labels, the serving sizes can vary so much relative to what we're recommending and talking about here. Also, like what you would get in a restaurant or buy in a store, right? Like I'm sitting here saying that the guidelines say protein should be 5.5 ounces per day, but if you go out to a store, in fact, one of my favorite restaurants here, they have a 1-pound steak on the menu. That's more than double the amount of protein that anybody would need the entire day, let alone a single meal. So that's because there is no standardized definition of serving size, and its serving size is not regulated in this country. Okay, so here are examples of the ounce equivalents. Let's just look at the protein foods and the grain foods. So for grains, again, the recommendation is 6 ounces or ounce equivalents. Very rarely are we eating grains in ounces. So an example is like a cooked whole grain like brown rice. 1/2 cup is equivalent to 1 ounce. So I don't recommend this, but say you were going to get all of your carbohydrate, or you're going to get all of your grains from brown rice one day. So if you need 6 ounce equivalents and 1/2 of a cup is 1 ounce, then you would wind up eating 3 cups of rice that day to get your 6 ounce equivalents. On the protein food group, there's 5.5 ounce equivalents per day. Let's see, so for a meat or a fish, 1 ounce is 1 ounce, but for a bean, 1/4 cup is 1 ounce. So if you were going to get your ounce equivalents from beans alone, right, you would have to have a 1.25 cups really, to get to 5.5 ounce equivalents per day. And then almonds or other nuts, 1/2 ounce. 1/2 ounce is a 1 ounce equivalent. I know that's kind of dense. You can definitely take a minute to kind of let that settle in and think that through. Again, these recommendations are based on the 2,000 calorie a day diet. So again, somebody who is 45 or 50, sits at a desk all day, doesn't engage in exercise, probably doesn't need 6 ounces of grains a day. These are one of our higher energy foods, right? What else can we say about serving size? So also in recent years, we've seen tons of challenges, right, with serving size, because there's this trend towards supersizing everything, like the restaurant I just suggested, and also obviously all of our fast food restaurants supersize everything and tend to somehow charge you less if you buy more. Also, again, I'll just use the protein example. 5.5 ounces is not a whole lot, right? If you actually put 5 ounces of protein on your plate, like of a pork chop or of a chicken, that might be what you might typically serve yourself, but that's the recommendation for the entire day, not for one meal. So the serving sizes on the USDA food patterns are usually much smaller than what most of us actually eat. So again, that presents some challenges, particularly in the context of weight gain. But remember, obesity is oftentimes a kind of a stepping stone to other chronic diseases. So best thing to do regarding serving sizes, definitely become familiar with that ounce equivalence concept and start to measure your food. I'm a big fan of, encouraging everybody to buy a cheap kitchen scale. $10 you can buy a kitchen scale, and just keep it in your kitchen. They're not very large. We have a small one that just goes in one of our drawers, and just periodically weigh things out, or measure things out. Measure out a quarter cup of beans, measure out a half cup of cooked rice or oatmeal, measure out 2 to 3 ounces of chicken or pork or fish, and try eating just that much and see what it's like. Use the diet planning tools on myplate.gov, and again, measure your food intake. Alrighty, so that concludes our conversation specifically around the dietary guidelines for Americans. What I want to share with you in these next few slides are other dietary recommendations that are relevant and reliable. So, and I share this just because, again, there's no singular way to eat that is very healthy. And I think the best thing for each of us to do is to kind of, again, think about our preferences, think about what's important to us, and especially as you kind of grow into your adult life, figure out how you want to eat and what you want to eat and what's important to you in the context of these healthy guidelines, and then, carve out your own way of eating, carve out your own plan. It doesn't have to look like anything else. So these are just some other examples, some other ways of eating that you might consider, or you might let inform or influence your choices. So the Mediterranean diet is one of the most studied eating patterns around the globe. And it is, I want to say all of, but I'll say the majority of the research that looks at the Mediterranean way of eating suggests that it is a very healthy way of eating overall and throughout the lifespan. So what are some of the tenets of the Mediterranean way of eating, or the Mediterranean diet? I'll say here, to start here. So the daily foods include whole grains, fruits, beans, legumes, vegetables, nuts, cheese, and yogurt. Therefore, this diet is very high in minerals, vitamins, fiber, phytonutrients, and probiotics. We'll talk about those in chapter 3. The primary fat for cooking is olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat, so very low in saturated fat. And things like red meat are eaten maybe once a month. Eggs, poultry, fish, and sweets are eaten weekly, not daily. That makes this diet low in saturated fat and low in refined sugars or added sugars. And then alcohol is included in moderation. So again, a lot of this is very similar to what the USDA, the dietary guidelines, are suggesting. Just a few kind of tweaks and just sort of shifting the focus a little bit, especially towards these daily foods. I guess the primary thing I would point out here is that when we think about protein foods, the daily food source for protein is legumes like beans and lentils, whereas things like red meat, eggs, fish, poultry are eaten less frequently. There's also this tool called the exchange system, or sometimes called the diabetic or diabetes exchange system, because it's typically used for people with diabetes. And it's also really similar concept, but there are 6 food categories in this case. So there's starches or breads, which is kind of grains. There are meat and meat substitutes. There are vegetables, there are fruits, there's milk, and there's fat. And so within each of these different groups, a certain amount is suggested, similar to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And then somebody who's working with the diabetes exchange system or is probably also working with a nutrition professional so they can learn how to use the exchange system. But quite simply, you would just choose different foods from each of these groups for each meal and throughout the day, making sure you meet and don't exceed the amount recommended for each of these groups. Again, very similar to how a person might use the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Some other alternatives to My Plate. So another teaching tool I like a lot is the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, and I do have a link to this in the in the week's content on Blackboard. And I think I have the picture here. Yeah, so here's the Healthy Eating Plate from Harvard, not from the USDA. It's super similar to the USDA plate. The main difference is that the grains group is specified as whole grains, and it says to eat a variety of whole grains and to limit refined grains. Again, still vague, not saying eat only whole grains, but at least making the point to limit refined grains like white bread and white rice. The beverage of choice is water, and it is suggested to limit milk and dairy products to 1 to 2 servings per day. Very different from the USDA that says we need to drink 3 glasses a day. And then they put the healthy oils part on the plate and do suggest, again, to use healthy oils like olive oil and canola oil to avoid trans fat and to limit butter. Again, they don't really specify amounts because all of these are so specific to an individual. There aren't standardized quantities that we all need to be eating. Again, the dietary reference or the Dietary Guidelines for Americans chose to state recommendations for a 2,000 calorie diet. But again, most people eat above or below a 2,000 calorie diet. So those recommendations for how much of each food do have to be tweaked person to person. Yeah, so other things to point out about the Healthy Eating Plate from Harvard, again, focus on using plant oils, focus on whole grains, consume more vegetables, select the lean proteins. Again, pretty similar, but lastly, choosing water, coffee, or tea with no added sugar in place of milk. There's also something called the Power Plate. I don't remember if I included an image, but the Power Plate breaks the food groups out into 4 groups, which are fruits, beans and lentils, vegetables, and whole grains. So this is kind of a plant focused way of eating, or could even be a plant exclusive way of eating. Nuts and seeds are certainly also allowed, but the focus, so each meal should be comprised of fruits, beans, vegetables, and whole grains would be that way of eating. And again, not all that dissimilar from the Healthy Eating Plate or the My Plate, because if you look here, the 4 key groups that are on here are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and if you select legumes as your protein source, well, that's the Power Plate. So tons of overlap here. Again, just want to share some different ways to think about this information and different ways to influence and motivate your own self towards healthy eating choices. Some other technologies that are utilized for healthy diet. Again, myplate.gov has some online resources, so a daily checklist, a calculator, the USDA's nutrient database for standard reference. And you can even just kind of Google this, like when you're curious to learn about the nutrition content of a food, you would just like ask Google. And most often, the USDA's nutrient database is one of the first references that comes up. Pearson has a software called My Diet Analysis. We're not going to use that this semester, but it is a tool that you could use if you wanted to pay for it. Then there are some apps, tons of apps. I just listed 3 that I use frequently here. MyFitnessPal, this is the one that we will use this semester for the My Diet Analysis project. A Fitbit, a chronometer, or sorry, a Fitbit is like any of those watches that track your movement and track your caloric expenditure. So you can use that to find out really exactly how many calories you do expend in a day. And then Chronometer is another nutrition tracking app. There are tons of different nutrition tracking apps. And now there are tons of different watches, like the Apple Watch, the Whoop watch or whatever, where you can, again, kind of get minute by minute updates about what your body's doing, especially in relation to caloric expenditure. Just some tips for managing a healthy diet when we eat out and don't eat at home. So really important to note that a lot of restaurant foods are served in excessively large portions. So oftentimes a single restaurant meal might already exceed the recommended fat or calorie intake for a whole day. So just keep that in mind. Some things you might do there, right, would be like, again, looking at the menu and choosing the more nutrient-rich foods and being mindful not to have the more calorie-dense foods. If you're going to choose calorie-dense, maybe ask for a take-home container when the food comes out and put half of it in the container so that you only eat half of it. Share with your other meal mates. What else? Some other things have actually been put in place to try to help consumers make healthier choices when eating out. So in 2016, the FDA required nutrition labeling in chain restaurants and a lot of other food outlets. Like I know Panera is a pretty popular place to go, Starbucks, and they have to display their nutrition information on the foods they're selling. So calorie information must be clearly posted for consumers, and any other nutrition information must be available upon request. So this, let's see, I think, alrighty, so this is just McDonald's and Burger King, it looks like. But these are just two tables showing you kind of the calorie content, the fat content, and the sodium content. So these are two nutrients we want to limit, right? And obviously calories, we have a natural limit for as well. So just kind of, you can take a look at this on your own time, but obviously, hopefully, obviously, a lot of these are what we call calorie-dense, empty calorie foods, right? Very few foods that we're going to find at a fast food restaurant are health foods. All right, so eating out on a healthy diet, opt for the lower fat or lower calorie menu items if you can take a look at the nutrition information. Again, if it's a small local restaurant, they might not have the calorie information, but if it's a larger chain, can't hurt to ask. They should have it. You might avoid all-you-can-eat buffets because it might be easier to manage your intake that way. Avoid appetizers, or at least avoid those that are breaded, fried, or cheese-filled or meat-filled. You might consider ordering from the children's menu if you can. You might also consider getting an appetizer as your entree, because it's usually going to be a smaller portion. Order broth-based rather than cream-based soups or pastas or other dishes. Again, selecting lean cuts of meat that are not fried. Maybe go with a vegetarian option. That's always going to be lower, almost always going to be lower calorie. Choose a side salad with a low-fat or non-fat dressing. Again, maybe a vinegar-based dressing rather than a cream-based dressing. Choose the veggie option as the side. Drink water as your beverage or an unsweetened tea. Avoid syrups and heavy creams. Take some food home, right? You don't have to eat everything that comes on your plate. I love this image from your textbook. I took off what number it is, but again, this is somewhere in chapter 2, just showing the supersized, how food has become supersized. So like 20 years ago, right, a bagel was 3 inches in diameter. Now they're huge, like 6 inches. So again, that's why if you go with the ounce equivalents, right, so if you were to weigh out how much this bagel weighs, you can determine the ounce equivalent. Because, right, with these larger sizes of everything now, we think, okay, well, if I'm eating one bagel, that's probably 1 serving. But really, it's twice what a bagel used to be 20 years ago. So where we think we're still just eating 1 serving, we're now eating double the calories. Same thing with a lot of beverages, especially at those fast food restaurants, right? Like again, Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's, wherever you might get your coffee beverages. One serving of coffee is only 8 ounces. Most of these places won't even serve you 8 ounces. The smallest you can get is 12, right? So being mindful if you're getting any cream or sugar put into it, that's a lot of empty calories in the form of cream and added sugar. Okay, so that's it for chapter 2. As I did with chapter 1, and as you'll see with all the future lectures, for these last little bit, I'm just gonna quietly thumb through the remaining slides, pause them and think through the questions on your own time, and then go forward and see what the answer is. If you have any questions or are super confused by any of these little review questions, please just send me an email and we can find time to chat about it in real time or just chat about it via email. Alrighty, as always, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in chapter 3.